I want to welcome you for our second panel discussion after the second part of our lecture series. So in this part we heard four lectures. First by Mirko Canavaro, who will not be joining us. Second by Elodie Payat. Third by Andrew Hansen and Rob Fleck. And the last one by Josh Ober from Stanford, who unfortunately cannot join us either. And this also concludes the whole series, Tyranny and Democracy. The first year focused on antiquity. So, Edmund, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. So it's great to be it's been a very exciting year, and I hope you have all found that to be so, and a highly stimulating set of talks. So we were thinking, as I said in my email, just to sort of open up the floor, beginning with our speakers, just for ask the simple question, what has been your reactions to the papers that have been given this year and this term, and how maybe has your thinking progressed, or were there any particular thoughts that you wanted to raise from that? So we want perhaps Elodie, would you like to start us off?
Yes, why not? Thank you, and good evening, everyone, or good morning. I'm not sure where you are all. Yeah, indeed. I think it was a very stimulating series of talk. We had a look at this question of tyranny and democracy in the ancient and modern world from very different points of view. And for me personally, it has actually been very useful for one particular reason. I thought that I had understood, what tyranny was or what tyranny is, and it happens that it's much more complicated than what I thought I had understood. So definitely it proves that the whole lecture series was indeed useful, because as you all know, progress in history is always towards more complexity and more nuance rather than less. So for me, I thought indeed it has been very useful. And from the point of view of a classicist, of course, I could take a lot from other classicists' papers. For example, Edmund Stewart's and Mirko Canavaro's paper were the ones that were more directly useful to my work. But your paper, Andrew Hansen and your colleagues, was also very, very interesting to me, and very, very intriguing. So I thought that here there is something to definitely talk about a bit more. I would love to talk about what you think and find a bit more. I have worked on other topics than theater, including this kind of transition between non-democracy to democracy, and so there is more work to do here between people who look at the modern world and people who look at the ancient world. So for me, it was a brilliant experience. So thank you.
And Elodie, maybe you could sort of, against the background of all the lectures that we heard, could you restate your main points that you made in your contribution, maybe pointing out, whether anything changed in your thinking when you had an opportunity to listen to other lectures, or maybe thinking this through, or you just are confirmed in your basic findings?
Yeah, so perhaps I can quickly go through what I had said. So my talk was really focused on the ancient tyrants' use of theater, and in particular Greek theater. So I took the term tyrants as meaning autocrats in general. Whether they were really tyrants in the strict sense or not, I can't tell, but I put all the autocrats under this umbrella term of tyrants. And so I began by focusing for quite a long time on the history of scholarship, because this question of tyrants and democracy had been neglected for a long time. Ancient Greek theater was conceived as being almost exclusively a classical Athenian thing, with almost everything that came after or that was performed outside of Athens being less good, less interesting. And so, fortunately, in recent scholarship, we have a bit moved from this idea. And so my talk was happening within this framework of an interest in theater outside of Athens and in post-classical periods. So what I did is I took several examples of tyrants using theater. So starting from the classical period with tyrants outside of the main Greek world, if you want, for example, in Caria or in the Black Sea area, who used the Greek theater. Then I moved to Alexander the Great, then to Hiram II in Sicily, and then finally, for a longer part of my talk, because that's my area of expertise, the use of Greek theater by Roman emperors. So it adds a bit of a layer of paradox, if you want, in what I was talking about. And so maybe it would be useful here, rather than going through these examples again, just to summarize why tyrants used theater. So, of course, theater was one of the best ways of broadcasting a message in antiquity, whatever the message might have been. Unfortunately, the content of those plays that might have been performed in tyrannical or autocratic contexts is almost always lost. So it's difficult to reconstruct what kind of direct propaganda might have taken place. But nonetheless, it is possible to explore what kind of advantages the very act of organizing theatrical performances may have brought to tyrants. So that was my focus. And dramatic performances were, of course, also one of the most appreciated types of entertainment for centuries. So any leader providing lavish dramatic performances could showcase himself as benevolent towards his subjects, and was very much appreciated for it. One of the things that I didn't emphasize very much, but I should probably have done it a bit more, we had an interesting point rise during the discussion after my talk, and it was about the religious aspects of dramatic performances. And so here I kind of, I can tend to underestimate those aspects, but they were actually very important. And theatrical performances in antiquity were indeed religious occasions. And they helped, in many cases, they helped the autocrats link themselves, and in some cases their families as well, to the god Dionysus, the god of theater, or to the divine realm in general, to the gods. And it worked as an efficient tool to legitimize their position above their subjects. And this idea that theater might have helped tyrants to legitimize their absolute power is something that comes back all the time, and I have tried to show that in my talk, and I think that's one of the most important points. Theater made the tyrants at the margins of the Greek world look like they were connected to the cultural and political center, so Athens during the classical period, for example. And therefore, it helped them appear like more legitimate leaders than, for example, rival members of the elite. So it was very, very useful for the tyrant or would-be tyrant to use theater to show that they were connected to the cultural and political center. And don't forget that organizing theatrical performance was probably one of the most expensive type of entertainment you could have in antiquity. So they had to actually use their wealth and in a way only someone who was way above the others in terms of wealth could organize those such type of entertainment. So again, theater was also a powerful tool to federate populations around the figure of the tyrant or the leader or the autocrat. And you can remember here Alexander the Great, who might have used his own soldiers to play roles in a satire drama, so to federate the army again around him. And theater, and especially Greek theater, I would say, was the best tool for tyrants, including Roman emperors, and that's the second paradox, to broadcast the fact that they mastered culture, education, paideia, and as such, they show themselves as better than the others again, as above them. So theater could be used as part of the strategy of tyrants to show themselves as possessing more cultural capital, and I would say, therefore, more honor, to tie that up to what Mirko Canavero had said. So theater helped them to show that they had more culture, more education, more honor than their rivals and their subjects. And then, and perhaps more importantly for the whole series, a final point of my discussion was to reflect on a possible parallel between the use of social media by modern autocrats or would-be autocrats and the ancient tyrants. So the parallel has been made very, very often. It is, of course, not perfect, but there is a distinct democratic feel to social media, and that can be put into parallel to the fact that theater could, in some cases, provide a democratic facade to tyrannical ambitions. I doubt that it was a game that had been played very often by tyrants. It's quite dangerous for a tyrant to even open the door to democratic ideas, but that can have been the case in some parts of the world at some point. So I haven't really made up my mind about that, so we can think about it further. And finally, most interesting, I think, would be the parallel to be drawn between ancient tyrants' use of especially Greek classical theater as a marker of superiority, and perhaps, for example, modern fascist groups' use of antiquity-related iconography, for example. So in a way, studying the use by ancient tyrants of theater as a way to use culture in an exclusive way, in the etymological sense of the term. So the use of culture that leave others a bit outside because they don't master culture as well as themselves. That's something that could be useful for our modern reflections as well, and perhaps to encourage us to keep an eye open about any elitist or exclusive way in which cultural education is sometimes used by non-democratic or anti-democratic groups wherever in the world. So yeah, I think that summarizes what I wanted to say, and the questions I still have.
Thank you. It's interesting you, as he's not here, I thought I might bring in the Mirko Cannavaro's paper, which you alluded to. And we were wondering before this, Mathieusz and I, before this meeting, so how your paper fits in with his, because I was thinking particularly if we can take some of those ideas about honor and apply them to thinking about the uses of theatre by tyrants or by autocrats. Where is the honor in that? So is it that the tyrant is attempting to gain honor and respect for as a euergetes, as a benefactor of the populace? Are there possibilities for others, poets and actors, or potentially, I mean, choregoi as well? I might think of, for example, Alexander's use of the Cypriot kings as choregoi in his competitions at Tyre. How do you think the economy of honor would work in these situations?
Well, that's a difficult and therefore interesting question. I think that it might have been partly the case that there was this wish to appear as a benefactor, so to acquire honor in a way by organizing theater performances. But I think that's not the world there is. I think that perhaps before that or above that, the very fact of being able to organize dramatic performances, theatrical contests, or such type of entertainment actually showed that the tyrants already had more than the others. So more wealth, more education, more people that he could federate around him to organize those kind of giant scale events, I would say. Whether all those elements could enter into honor, I'm not sure. I would put them into under the umbrella term of honor. Certainly the quantity of your wealth and your education and your support group in a way contributes to the perception that others have of you as someone who is more honorable, who is above the others. So I think it works a bit as a self-reinforcing circle, if you want.
Yeah, I also think, if I may butt in, that your paper sort of opened an important question of the role of culture, art, literature, and all of that, and its place in tyrannical regimes versus democratic regimes. I think in the first part of the series, at some point we discussed the fact that tyrannical regimes almost never advertise themselves as tyrannical regimes, right? So they have liberal constitutions like Stalin's constitution of 1936, with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of that. So it's very rare if it exists even, that a tyrannical state says explicitly, we don't appreciate freedom, we are basically a tyranny. So I find it curious. And I think what you talked about is another facet of this, because tyrannical regimes often suppress art and literature, but they never explicitly say that this is their goal. So they want to appear as cultured, they want to appear, as you claimed, as being sophisticated. Another question is whether they succeed. But of course, the communist art, which was sometimes very ugly, it was advertised as the new art, which will sort of win with the traditional bourgeois rotten literature and art. But there is always this idea that a tyrant, as Edmund points out, has everything, not only power and wealth and knowledge, but also beauty is a part of his possessions. So that would be one explanation, and the idea of honor and the dynamics of honor would explain it as well. But the other thing is that culture is also used as a tool for propaganda, right? But that's a weapon also, because for instance, you can hear arguments like, okay, this country is not a democracy, but look at its culture. This is a traditional argument you can hear in a relationship between the Western Europe and Russia, for instance, right? So even today, some people say, okay, so Russia is bad, but you know, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky. So let's not, for instance, like Macron said, let's not humiliate Russia because you know it has such a great culture. So this is an interesting modern phenomenon, which maybe we could also sort of contextualize in ancient literature. But as you said, the pity is that we don't have enough sources. We don't know what kind of plays the tyrants would support, right?
Yeah, only very little, unfortunately. And the paradox is that among all the fragments we have, it's of course easier to link some to tyrants when it's clear that the fragment is from a play that defended the tyrant's idea or established the tyrant as someone good or as a benevolent leader. But among the mass of other things we have in a fragmentary state, or we don't have at all, then yeah, it's very difficult to reconstruct. And even when we have good chunks of a play, as in the case of a Latin play that have been performed in honor of a Roman emperor, it's very difficult to understand why, how it all worked. And the problem is especially difficult when we think about tragedy, because in tragedy, tyrants are usually not presented in a very good light, to say the least. So here there is a second layer of paradox, if you want. We know that tyrants used tragedy among other theatrical genres, and that's a very big problem. It's, for the moment, there is no real definitive answer, because we just don't have enough sources to think about it really precisely. But at least the question can be asked, and why a tyrant would, for example, reperform a play that presents tyrants in a bad way. So several answers have been sometimes given, such as you can present tyrants in a bad way to actually say, okay, that's a bad tyrant, I am not a bad tyrant, or I am not a tyrant at all, I'm not like that. Or when you are a really well-established tyrant, you just do whatever you want. If you like a play where a tyrant is presented in a bad light, you can just not care and have it performed. It's a bit of a dangerous game to play, but who knows, frankly. It's not. I think we tend to kind of homogenize history in a way that was certainly not the case not the case. I think each tyrant has a different use of theater, frankly, almost each tyrant. So
yes, and
yeah.
I wonder whether there isn't. Yes, I mean, I think would be tempted often to think in comparative terms, but I wonder whether there isn't a need to be cautious in thinking about totalitarianism and its uses of culture versus perhaps what we have in the ancient world, where it might be that we are dealing with a use of culture to present the ruler as someone who listens to wise advisors, who is himself, as you say, someone with paideia, and that is very important. But I wonder whether we should be cautious of any attempt of thinking of an attempt to use to sort of twist culture into a particular ideology, such as we find with sort of totalitarian regimes, such as Soviet Russia. But that's just, I wonder, maybe a caveat there, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, I think any kind of generalization is bad, but it's especially bad for the ancient world because we don't even have half of the information we have for the modern period. So we can have access to less than 10% of all the evidence that was created, that existed. So.
And it seems to me, in any case, the content of these plays is less important, because I suppose when one looks at something like Aeschylus's Aetnaeae, or another maybe Theodectes' Mausolus, or Euripides' Archelaus, the amount of focus on the king is actually relatively minimal. We're looking at a mythical story from which, of course, we can draw a good message at the end of the poem, but there isn't actually I mean, it is a tragedy, but obviously it's a tragedy that has a nice political spin to it. But it doesn't seem to me that the content is so important as maybe running the festival, as someone like Hieron II having his name on the theatre at Syracuse, and being the person who has this massive altar with all of these bulls being sacrificed on it. I wonder whether that's maybe more important than specific content. I mean, although of course content is, it is significant. I mean, we can see that in Pindar, obviously, but then again, it's not the whole thing. It's the and again, in Pindar, I think it's what Pindar is doing is he's presenting this same message over and over again, that someone like Hieron I is a wise ruler who listens to wise advisors. That seems to be, if you want a sort of message from this poetry, that seems to be it, I would have thought.
Yeah, and
yes.
So yeah, go ahead, Ali.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think the point you make about the content is indeed very important, and comes up even more vividly for the use of Greek theater in the Roman periods, where we don't exactly know how much of the content of the reperformed plays was actually still there. We don't exactly know how much people in the audience actually understood. So I would definitely agree with you that it's the very fact of organizing those festivals, those events, that had the biggest impact. But perhaps we just say that because we don't have the content and we are frustrated because we can't.
You raise, I mean, both you and Edmund, are raising a very important point, which links us to what Andrew and Robert did, namely that we feel compelled to compare ancient tyranny and ancient democracy to the modern constitutions or regimes which bear the same name, while, I mean, we are more or less acutely aware how they are different, right? So what was fascinating to me is that at the same time, when the closer we look into, you know, the tyranny of the ancient Syracuse or the Athenian democracy and the modern, let's say, you know, the dictatorship in some South American country or a totalitarian regime of China, we find more differences, it seems, in details than similarities. The same with Athenian democracy and the democracy of any of the you know, Western European or North American states. But still, we are very convinced that it's viable to compare them with each other, and we feel that there is something connecting those regimes throughout history, centuries of years, and that we can learn something about our political life by studying people who lived in an entirely different world. So I think that's very interesting, and it brings up the whole issue of interdisciplinarity and kind of trying to combine classics with political sciences and all of this. So we can also, you know, try to link this with Andrew and Rob's and also Josh's paper, which are very, I think, as a classicist, I was very inspired by those approaches. I didn't find them alien or, you know, not relevant at all. So what do you think?
Yes, so shall we, that might be a good moment to bring in Andy and Rob here, and I should have said on the way, so if anyone would like to, as I say, this is a very informal conversation, so if you would like to sort of butt in at any point, do please do so, or if you would like to raise your hand, do please do that as well. But perhaps we can ask Andy and Rob, what are your, again, so say the same sort of question. So if you could maybe briefly run through your main thesis and maybe suggest how maybe your ideas have been better informed or changed or vindicated by some of the other discussions we've had in this series.
Well, maybe I'll start, and then Rob will follow me. What we presented was sort of in the nature of a fishing expedition to sort of see what we'd find. And I think one of the things that I've taken from this conference is that the commonalities are a lot greater than I would have thought, and particularly with something like tyranny, in the sense that we can find enormous differences between any given tyrant we might look at back then and any given dictator we might look at today. But I think we find somewhat similar differences just looking across modern dictatorships, for example, and ancient tyrannies, if I understand correctly. And so in a certain sense, it's made me believe that there's more that can be learned by comparing over time in the way that we do, or I mean, the way that all of us are doing, than might be thought at first glance when you'd say, oh, you're talking a huge period of time differences. People thought about the world differently, they lived differently. But the bottom line is they had the same kind of problems they had to solve. You've got to somehow arrange a government that is going to decide certain things and is going to make certain policies, is going to wage war in some circumstances, is going to defend the state in others. And there's a limited number of ways you can organize that. And if you decide to organize it through one individual, that individual is going to be constrained in certain ways and unconstrained in others. It's going to be very different than if you organize it through a collective. If you organize it through a collective, you're going to face the same kind of problems of collective action that modern political scientists talk about. You have sort of different voting problems and that kind of thing. And you're going to have to find some kind of way of dealing with it. And I think what makes the comparison so interesting is often the Greeks had somewhat different ways of dealing with these things than the U.S. Not than the U.S. than modern democracies do. And I think that that's, it's understanding those differences. I think that really makes this such an interesting topic. Maybe I'll stop with that and pass it over to Rob.
Yeah, I agree with that. A couple things to note is definitely, my thinking changed a lot. One thing was just to follow Odie here, I echo some of that. I'd always kind of wondered what I meant when I was saying tyranny, and now I don't feel so bad about it because it's really difficult. But the conversations were great. I also really mean the conversations. I enjoyed all the paper presentations, and thank you for recording them for when we were teaching and stuff. But the discussions afterwards, like the one we just had, the first half hour here was really interesting. And for people like Andy and me, we definitely want to look for general patterns. It's what we do. So, we're going to do that, but with proper caveats. But it's very interesting listening. And I think one of the things that I've taken away from this is, like, if you think about people watching plays a couple thousand years ago, they obviously didn't think just like we did, but we still recognize the humor, the villains, the heroes, and sort of how you'd put in the role of a tyrant there is interesting because it's unclear. Just like today, there's people that some people think are heroes and the rest of us don't, and vice versa. So we thought that was I thought that was all just fascinating, and I really do think I have a better idea of tyrants. As far as like how that shaped where we go is. We mentioned in our talk, the first paper we'd written on tyranny. It took us a while. We had these really nice data that Josh Ober had done, enormous favor in sending us, but we were trying to figure out how to use the tyranny data. And basically, what we had in the data set is something that says T for there was a tyrant, and so we just had that, and we realized we would go with the era when they were half bad and the era where most people didn't think they were half bad. They were all bad. And we thought, okay, there's two categories, but the discussion is we knew before, but the discussion has really made it clear that if we're really going to try and model sort of more than just the effect of having a tyrant, in the simplistic sense, there's an interesting process of how those tyrants were chosen, and it's sort of chosen compared to what, and so there would be. And from Josh's discussion, the tyrants may be chosen for different reasons, even in the same era. And it's also compared to what? Are you choosing a tyrant versus a democracy, or a tyrant versus an oligarchy? And also by whom? It wasn't, electing a tyrant per se, but it may have been with the acquiescence of the demos. It may have been put in by oligarchs, or maybe just, more broadly, aristocrats. And that's an interesting difference. And I think this is something we can compare to the modern era. If you think of something like just, a monarchy where it's just one monarch after another, chosen essentially by the system, where, the tyrants were not like that. It wasn't this, if there was there were 8 generations of the same family being tyrants, I think we'd probably code that more like a monarchy. So I think that coming back to that is something that we'll try to do, is look back at the data and see if we can define tyranny more carefully, and also not just what the nature of the tyrant was in terms of how bad, but who chose him and why. And we've had some thoughts on that. Anyway, I think that was that's sort of my main takeaway. I also thought the discussion of honor was, just make one comment on that. That was really interesting because sort of a broader way to think about why someone might want to establish some system of honor is if they can signal some attribute about their own person or about other people, and sort of tie that in terms of what Josh was discussing. It's a choice of a tyrant. How would a tyrant rule? And so any kind of past behavior might establish that. So we might expect a tyrant to be self-interested but honorable, or maybe not so honorable, but their self-interest isn't too out of line with what we would want, or something like that. But it just seems like that question of honor is a very interesting one that would be worth pursuing too. And I by the way, I have no idea what the answer to the question would be on how did the role of honor work, but it just seemed like that would be something that would be very relatable to the modern world too.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting set of thoughts. It occurs to me that, I mean, I think you made an excellent case for the possibility of comparative study, and I think you're very much preaching to the choir here, as I'm in that choir certainly. What I wonder is if we can. You made it was either you, Rob, or Andy made the point about, well, if any kind of comparative study, we're dealing with significant differences, and that is true. No one has a problem comparing authoritarian regimes in the modern world, but there are vast differences between them. So I wonder whether we shouldn't be thinking about, when we look at, in the same way we look at modern dictatorships, we can see differences in structures, and we can see, so if we can get a sense of the political structures, the way in which power is distributed, if we can get a sense of that, and then compare that to the ancient world, and I think with the ancient world, as I've suggested, the best comparison between an ancient tyranny is perhaps a modern personalist dictatorship. So we can take into account those differences in structures and also differences in means to get the same ends. It's all very well saying, well, modern dictators have parties and organized parties. Well, that is true, but what is the purpose of a party, setting up your own party? The purpose of setting up your own party is to have a tool to control power, or indeed, if it's a party set up by someone else, maybe that sets a limit on the leader's ability to gain power. So I think our ancient tyrants are using different tools in many cases, but not in all cases. I think they have very obviously things like bodyguards and monopolizing access to weapons and things like that is going to be very familiar. So that was just an observation on what you said.
And also, I'm wondering, because one of the, I think, most important aspects of Andy's and Rob's paper was the question of how stable versus fragile are those political structures, like tyranny and democracy, in antiquity and later and nowadays. And also, I mean, the students of ancient political thought are, of course, under the enormous influence of Plato's Republic, Book 8 and 9, where Plato, exactly what is of interest to him is how constitutions change or how governments change. So clearly his observation of the political life of the ancients inspired this, but also the Greeks seem to be very much interested in how one form of government changes into another one. Today, I guess we are interested in the same thing, because, for instance, how much of the political and public discourse in democratic countries right now is about whether we are going into something non-democratic or not. I guess in dictatorships, this is not the big topic for discussion, whether we are getting democratic or not. But the sense that the constitution is not given and stable, but it can change, and the change is sometimes very violent and bloody and dirty and destructive. I think it's a very important topic, and your statistical analyses, they were very, very interesting in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is one of the interesting features of the modern world, is that we all know that democracies are more wealthy. They have better rates of economic growth. People enjoy more liberty. People live longer. There's all kinds of measures that say democracies are better than non-democracies. Yet at the same time, there are a lot of non-democracies that try to become democracies and fail. And I think that's one of the differences I found interesting in the comparison of the modern world and ancient Greece. And I should put a caveat in here, which is that it's a little bit hard to tell how much is coming from the fact that the data sets, are not quite comparable and not quite as complete, but that you really sort of have a set of states in the modern world that are very stable democracies. And that seemed to be more likely in our modern data set, even when we sort of restricted ourselves to the common set of states. And I thought that was an interesting, if that's true, that's a sort of an interesting difference here, that there seemed to be more movement between regime types among that, relatively small set of states that we have, polis that we have information for, than in the modern world, where you really can sort of say, okay, we've got the stable democracies and we've got the unstable democracies. And, outside of the West, most democracies are unstable democracies. You have certain exceptions. Japan has been a very stable democracy, for example. And I didn't see that in ancient Greece, though you can certainly point to particular stable democracies. So I think that, that's sort of interesting there. And does that suggest that, well, let me add something to that I also find very interesting, which is that, when you talk about ancient Greece, whether you're talking about an oligarchy or I believe even a tyranny, and you and all can enlighten me about this, you're often talking about the same formal political institutions, a popular assembly, some kind of advisory council, a lack of a real specifically defined executive branch, except perhaps informally in the sense of the tyranny, but rather executive offices carried out by people working on, on a fixed term, chosen in some manner or other. And that's quite interesting that it's not that you're seeing big differences in formal institutions across ancient Greece as you move from one regime type to another, but rather you're seeing differences in maybe the power of those institutions, the authority of the institutions, or you're seeing differences in who can participate within the different formal institutions. And I think that is very interesting. And this I have not looked carefully at, but I would expect in the modern world, you're probably seeing more differences in the formal institutions as you move, particularly as you move to autocracies. And so again, I think there are these intriguing differences there between the modern and the ancient world that are hard to get at, but I think we could learn a lot, perhaps about both the modern and the ancient world, if we could plumb into those in more detail.
I wonder, sorry, just to come in, I think that's a really important point. But I think it's interesting how there are some polities in the ancient world that do seem to be more stable than others. And of course, the big ones are Athens and Sparta. It seems to me that Athens is, I mean, obviously, we could have a debate. I suppose Josh Ober here would argue that Athens was actually very successful and very stable, and there are exceptions to that. But I wonder whether it isn't partly because of the problems that Athens went through, beginning with Solon, and we've got a 200-year development of the constitution. So it is a long development. One might think of the British Constitution, or indeed the American Constitution. There's civil wars and the execution of kings, creating a lot of instability, but leading to something that has been pretty much fire tested. So I wonder whether there isn't perhaps a case for slightly more stable regimes in the ancient world. But I wonder whether when we look at stability, whether the ancient Greeks did not have the same idea of what would create stability, which is law and the strength of law and the strength of legal institutions. So I wonder whether that isn't again a similar means to a similar end, but obviously with slightly different results. Sorry, Elodie, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering about this idea of long-term stability. You are just mentioning Athens from Solon until pretty much the end of the 5th century. I think that perhaps we should refine a little bit our view of how stable it indeed was for such a long period. Perhaps the institutions were relatively stable indeed, But concretely, I'm not sure whether there hasn't been some rather dramatic changes in the degree of participation of the citizen population. It takes time before people actually take advantage of their new rights to participate politically in the democracy. And of course, it doesn't leave much traces in political history because the institutions don't change. But I would say that even if the constitution was not so different at the beginning of the 5th century than in the middle of the 5th century, there were still some very dramatic changes in who actually actively participated, who took advantage of their rights to vote, for example, their right to speak in the assembly. And so perhaps if we inject into our study of democracies and tyrannies one more level of detail, it changes the picture a little bit. And that's one of the things I was wondering as well for the data analysis, which are very compelling and very interesting because they definitely give results. At least I was persuaded. So there are patterns that appear very clearly. But now I would be very interested in hearing you, for example, about why those patterns, why those kind of regular changes from democracy to tyranny, or from oligarchy to whatever. Do you ask the question at all, or?
Well, there is a large literature on why in the modern world, both why some democracies are stable, why some states are successful, and others aren't. That does come down to the institutions, as they say, but not so much the formal institution necessarily, as witness Britain's unwritten constitution, which is very effective. Witness the U.S.'s written constitution, which is very effective, but somehow or other setting things up in a way that people have the incentive to respect the rules and the procedures and don't override them. Or it's not that people never try to override them. I mean, there's a hearing going on right now in the U.S. about that, but they don't succeed. And yet there are other countries where every time somebody comes to power, they rewrite the Constitution, they change the rules. And I think that it's pretty clear that an important part of a successful polity in the modern world is having this durability in the rules, that they get respected by losers as well as winners, and that they, and there may be something, and I think that Edmund's point is a good one. The longer they've been in effect, the more respected they are. And that could simply be, well, yeah, that's where they work, they're respected, and they last longer. But I also think you could think of it as sort of to put it in economic sense, you've built up a certain capital. You could think of this as a reputational capital in a certain way. There's really, so you're Argentina, and you're going to come in, and the last constitution was written 4 years ago, and you're going to say you scrap it, and the public is not going to care that much because it just hasn't been around that much. It really hasn't had much bite, hasn't had much effect, and so you're not losing that much. You scrap the U.S. Constitution, you're losing a lot. You're losing, basically a commitment that's been developed over 200 years of history. So I think that there is a really interesting question about that. What is it? And I think it sort of feeds back then into this notion of, you seem to have a set of, democracies that are very stable in their regimes, and then you have a set of states that sort of fluctuate between democracy and non-democracy a lot. Now, getting back to a lot of these comments, I think you're really raising fascinating questions and really important points. Now, one of the challenges that one faces if one wants to work with a larger scale data set, though, is it's very hard to drill down into that level of detail, for a large number of states. Now, in theory, you could do it in the modern world, and people do. There's actually so many kinds of measures, there's so many kinds of things in the modern world. I have the impression that for the states of ancient Greece, the polis of ancient Greece, I mean, we know a lot for a very small number. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the level of knowledge is greater. Certainly we've worked with the inventory, the Hans-Nielsen inventory, and there's a chunk of information about each of those states there. And maybe by using some of that information a bit more effectively, we could actually get at some of these things we're talking about. I don't know what you all know this area better than I do. What and know what is known about. I mean, the polis. Do you think it's possible to put together a sort of a data set of polis where you really could sort of start drilling down a little bit and getting into some of the subtleties that are you're bringing up?
Well, I wish, but but I'm afraid you are right. For many of them, we just can't really. Not sure it has been attempted really for all of them, and perhaps there is a bit more work to do on that. But indeed, it's really the example of what we have for Athens that make me suspect that there is much more than the basic info we have about the political constitution. And to draw a parallel to the modern world, being Swiss, I can tell you that we vote all the time, so we pretty much have still a very direct form of democracy, if you want, but only very rarely does more than half of the population vote. So it makes me suspect that perhaps when we talk about Athens as a direct kind of pure democracy, I think there might have been wide changes from the beginning, let's say until the third quarter of the 5th century. More people might have started to vote, more people might have started to talk actually in the debates and in the assembly, and it can change the way in which this democracy works. And for the other polis, we probably can't really go into that level of detail, but that's a question that is very dear to my heart, because when we speak about democracy, you get the feeling that, every citizen had the right to vote and to speak in the assembly. But then if only 10% of the citizenship does that, is it still a democracy? So, yeah.
What I find also interesting is the issue raised by Andy earlier, namely about the institutions, because it's, we didn't talk about that, I guess, this academic year very much, but there can be tyrannies or dictatorships which sort of maintain the whole facade of republic or democracy, and those which don't. So I think that today, at least in the Western world and those parts of the world which are somehow influenced by it, it's fashionable to have a dictatorship, but with a parliament, with public elections, things like that. So I'm not sure, but I think it's very rare that, for instance, you have a military coup and then parliament is abolished completely. Rather, there is this attempt to pretend that the constitution is something that it is not. And people, of course, know that this is not what it is, but still everyone is somehow taking part in this strange thing. And a little bit, I think, like that is the situation of ancient Rome, where you had republic, which then transformed into kind of a monarchy under Augustus. And then there were we call them emperors, but I'm not sure if they were technically emperors. they were the first citizens, and some of them were tyrants like Caligula or Nero or Domitian. Some of them were more trying to be more republican. The institutions were the same, but they could be used in different ways. But the Romans clearly, they wanted to live in a state with, the General Assembly and the Senate and consuls and all of that, while maybe the Athenians didn't. I mean, the Athenians could just overthrow democracy, and they didn't want to pretend that it's still democratic. They would just be like oligarchs or tyrants, or 30 tyrants. They would just rule directly without any pretense. So probably it depends on culture. Like the Romans seem to be very much accustomed to certain institutions and were very conservative. So they didn't want, maybe they wanted monarchy, but they didn't want to call it monarchy. So that's an interesting case. But in other countries, maybe people just don't care. So they don't have this love of institutions or things like that. But I think it's an interesting topic, both in antiquity and in modern times.
If I may just interrupt there, just a very quick response to some of those points. I think firstly, on the question of institutions, the length of institutions lasting, I think there's also another way you could look at it, which is that tyrants almost hollow out institutions and remove them, but which affects the stability. But also I think that there's I would be less pessimistic than perhaps Elodie has been in thinking. Yes, we have very little data on individual states, but I think if we add them all together, we can see hopefully a much bigger picture. And I think if Edward Harris were here, he'd make a comment on, for example, entrenchment clauses in a large number of inscriptions across the Greek world. So I think, and there's an attempt to try and entrench the laws and institutions, which seems to be quite widespread. So I just wanted to sort of end there by saying I think that there is great possibilities for exactly the kind of research that Andy outlined. But I'm afraid at this point I have to dash. If you'll excuse me, but
okay. I can take over, and we still, of course, have time to discuss, but we don't have to do the full 90 minutes. So we can just have a conversation and continue with those points.
Okay.
Okay, so do you want to add anything, or maybe raise a new issue which we haven't discussed so far?
Well, I should say I wasn't. I hope I didn't come across as pessimistic. I was really sort of more in the spirit of a question, not knowing the answer. I'm really pleased. The notion of the entrenchment clauses, I think that sounds really interesting, and that certainly is reason for some optimism. And I think those are the kinds of things that maybe it would be worthwhile sort of digging into a little bit, and then sort of trying to think about, is there modern equivalents, or does that just represent some broad category that we can think about? And I think that's exactly the way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think what Elodie tried to say is that we have several ancient polities which we have a lot of material about, but some of them are just names with, as you say, with T or D. And perhaps this creates an odd situation, which when you, as you said, when you compare states of which you have so different amount of knowledge in general, right? So, but yeah, here we are.
Yeah, one of the things Andy and I have discussed a lot is, suppose somebody in the future look back at data from the United States and they look at 50 states and try and figure out the changes in the institutions. And, there's going to be some things that you would see, but there have been so many changes that, without so many huge changes in the way the democracies function, especially on the state level, that would not show up very much in any kind of a data set on state constitutions. And sort of, the biggest one would be, that when Andy and I were born, the United States was clearly considered a democracy, but boy, did it vary. If you were born in the states we were born in, what race you were had no effect whatsoever on whether you could vote. But, South Carolina, where we are now, there was still widespread disenfranchisement. And so, that's something that was changed through formal rules, but it's only partly the formal rules that really made the difference. It was one, being willing to enforce those rules. And so I think it's really interesting. But a lot of the, what was really the really bad features of the American South prior to the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of that, it wasn't really, it was government enforcing bad things, but it's not something you would pick up so much in a data set. And even, turnout rates were very low, but that really wasn't the big deal. It was more that it was, who really ran the show and who could vote. Whereas, now, there's lots of elections in the United States with very low turnout. But if people don't care, that may be because they think it's fine. So, we just had election here yesterday, primary election, and a lot of us really weren't sure who was running. It's not something yeah. Anyway, so I think that's, it's a very interesting question. I think if we try to put ourselves like, how badly would we miss the big changes, and what would we think would be big changes which were really trivial, looking back, in American history, which is something we're much more familiar with, and think, well, if we try and do the same thing with ancient Greece, how bad could we, how far off could we be? And the answer is, boy, we could get everything backwards. So we're trying not to do that. But something like the entrenchment clauses, the reason why, both of us said, that, that's interesting, is that's something that's more concrete. And if we can actually get something coded there, it's possible we'd get things wrong, but it's a much safer thing to do than just try to infer, with really vague knowledge, what might have been going on formally and informally.
But methodologically speaking, it's much easier to stick to things like institutions. So, for instance, do you have a parliament or not? Or do you have elections or not? Or do you have judges and courts or not? So it's clearly easier. But then there is this whole discussion, as you say, what is true democracy versus some facade democracy, right? Because we know that you can hollow institutions, right? Or you can corrupt them, or you can misuse them. We know this from history. But this is a very interesting but also rather confusing area, because then people differ in their assessment of it, right? So for instance, you have judges in dictatorships, you have judges in democracies. They judge, they do their job, but of course we know that behind the scenes various things are going on, and people have different opinions on the extent to which those judges are legitimate, for instance. And when the communists were criticizing Western democracies in the 20th century and at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, people like Lenin, and so they were basically claiming that those are not real democracies. This is not a joke that Soviet Union claimed to be the real democracy. They really try to argue that the Western democracies are just hollow institutions because big corporations control everything. So those were classic communist arguments, also fascist ones, right? So okay, you have elections, you have parliaments, everything seems to be fine, but still those guys with money, they control everything. And this, we hear this all the time. So this is the whole idea of deep state and everything like that. I think it's very difficult to translate this into the kind of methodology that you are using, right, Andy and Rob, because we can't have clarity on that even to any degree, right?
Well, there is, there are so many measures around these days that there are actually measures for different countries of de jure judicial independence, for example, and de facto judicial independence, where they will actually go out and interview people and try to get some kind of measure of how independent the judge is. And what's interesting is it's always the de facto that matters. The de jure is not the thing. I mean, it's not surprising, right? Because you can write anything into a constitution. But it really is. You can have two identical constitutions, one of which produces a truly independent judiciary and the other which does not. And they're going to look the same on paper if that's all you have. And that's an advantage in the modern world, is that you can go, we do have people going in and trying to measure these in other ways. It always requires some degree of subjective judgment. But that's not possible going back to the ancient world, certainly. And even people today have some, even some researchers have some skepticism about using measures like that are based on surveys today. But I think it's an important distinction. You're absolutely right. The formal institutions are, they may or may not matter. They may, the Constitution may or may not be rules that bind. And that's really the question. What are the rules that bind? And that's hard to do. In a way, it's almost easier to just have D and T, right? If you got D and T, you're sort of saying, okay, well, we're just sort of setting all those things aside. People on, the consensus is it's a D, it's not a T. But of course, then you miss a lot of the subtleties. So there's a lot of trade-offs to be made, and I think that's part of what makes the research interesting and valuable. But it's also part of what makes it, something, if you just sort of launch into it and say, well, here's a bunch of D's, here's a bunch of T's, it's hard to know what to make of it. And that's a little bit where we are with our analysis right here. It's a little bit hard to know what to make of it, in a sense. We think there seem to be some interesting similarities. There seem to be some interesting differences. Are we really comparing like with like? It's very hard to know. I mean, people will argue even in the modern world, it's hard to compare like with like, given the institutional differences. But anyway, I throw that out not to be pessimistic, but just these are the necessary limitations I think analysis of these kind face, and one has to sort of deal with those the best they can, and that's the nature of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll definitely throw in that all the series of the talks and discussions it definitely makes me more optimistic that we'll actually be able to do some more empirical work that's reasonable. But because you've had great suggestions on things, we're trying to put a little bit more information, sensible information, into the data set.
Yeah, Elodie.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful discussion. While I have you here with your data sets, I had another question for you. Do you have any idea of the percentage of violent versus peaceful transitions between D and T, if you want, or is there a direction in which it's usually a peaceful transition and the reverse is rather violent, or do you see patterns here, or do you have any data on that?
I'll defer to Robin. I don't know what the my guess is that people have looked at that. I don't know, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've wondered the same, and we've read Dave Teagarden has a book on tyrants, and I can't remember exactly what he all has in the appendix, but we've talked with him too, and it does seem that there's more information there that we don't have. So to start, I should say, I have no idea how many were peaceful and how many were violent.
Were you talking the modern world, Elodie, or are you talking the ancient?
Well, I was thinking both, actually, to see if there is a parallel.
Oh yes, yeah. In the modern world, people do have records, and there is some coding in data sets, like the polity data set. I think I've got some coding there for something like in limbo. I can't remember what it is. I haven't looked for a while. I was thinking ancient because that's what we were curious about. And but yeah, that's something that we've been curious about, and we've talked with a few people about, including Josh, and also one of Josh's other students, Scott Arsenis, I think has some interesting information on that. So yeah, we hope to we hope to add that in.
Yeah.
That would be, I mentioned, so who did the choosing, of a, if a tyrant is, if it's chosen to put a tyrant in, who was behind that? And, that could be a decision of, like things are looking like they might be chaotic. And so just people say, okay, we'll just go with that guy, some of what Josh was talking about a couple of weeks ago. But it could just be that it was, it was a bloody mess. And in the end, people decided, let's just go with that guy instead of fighting or something like that. But that's a very different kind of transition. And if we had anything like that, that's a great thing, because that would be a nice, do we have a record of it being violent or not? And we don't know for sure how much violence there was, but if there's a record of violence, that, and then it's more likely that if there's no record of violence, at least more likely that it wasn't that violent. So we can probably consider that.
I mean, one of the interesting things to me in our data analysis was that you had lots of transitions. I mean, depending on the period of time, more or less, but directly from tyranny to democracy in the ancient world, almost none directly from autocracy to democracy in the modern world. Now, the caveat to that is, how much of that is simply the way things are measured on this measure we particularly haven't been using, that sort of runs from one extreme, which is, pure autocracy, to the other, which is pure democracy. And is it there's somehow some necessity that you run through this middle ground? But it did seem like in the ancient world, you do have a lot more direct transitions. In the modern world, you really don't have a lot of sort of overthrow the dictator and establish a democracy. I mean, you certainly had a number of democracies established right after the fall of the Iron Curtain, no doubt about that. And but it was not quite the same as we overthrow the evil dictator. And it'd be interesting to know whether is that a fundamental difference? Was the ancient Greek world much more of, we kill the tyrant and now we've got it and we found a democracy. We found. Yes,
even in the Central Eastern Europe after 1989, there were significant differences. Like, for instance, in Romania, where Ceausescu was really, it was a story of let's kill the tyrant, and it was violent. While in Poland, it was a sort of a transit. So we had for instance, in 1989, in June, we had an election, but it was a limited election, and the former tyrant was elected president by parliament, and only then, after 2 years, we had a totally free public election. And there was no violence. So you had those different situations and different scenarios, which is interesting because it depends on the history of a particular country, perhaps the way that tyranny functioned, the degree to which it was violent, maybe in itself. So there is a whole bunch of issues here.
Yeah, and external influences. I mean, in the ancient world, it's very clear. If you look at some cities and then the interaction with the Macedonians or other external influences, I mean, it plays an important role. It's not always that the police changes its constitution by itself.
Exactly. Yeah. That's an important point. I mean, like, for instance, the Athenian democracy installing democracies in other polis, like the United States, for instance, has done in the 20th century, or tyrannies installing tyrannies in other places. So clearly that there's a difference between this and an internal process or evolution, which leads to the change of constitution. Yeah, but again, I mean, in your database, it's not visible, right? Whether the change was internal or external.
It's not. I mean, that is a nice thing about the modern world. Is one could go back and just investigate on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't be surprised if there are, there's sort of scattered around, there are measures of sort of violent change versus non-violent change. So that is the thing about the modern world. Even if there's not an existing database, there's information that you can go back and look. There's not that many countries. It wouldn't take that long. And I guess that's the big difference about looking at modern data as opposed to ancient data. So a lot does depend on what the goal is. Is the goal to sort of, do this sort of comparison where you're rendering the modern data set as like the data set in ancient Greece, which is what we've done with the polity data. We've really stripped out a lot of information from that data. I don't know if I made that clear in my presentation, but it's a much richer data set. But in order to compare it to the ancient Greek data set, we had to, make it look like the ancient Greek data set. And we can go back and add a lot more to the modern data without, but the question is that something that's going to move us closer to being able to compare or understand with the ancient world? I guess that's the big question.
Okay, thank you. I think we may move towards the end. So yeah, this was a really fascinating series of lectures since October, and I think it's really important that we could discuss all those things, and it's a part of a larger project. I think we're trying to work on with Edmund to look. I mean, we already compared ancient regimes with the modern ones, but then in the next year we will do a series on early Christian thinkers and the Middle Ages, which is a period of time which is not often associated with democracy or republicanism, things like that. But I think it's interesting to see how the ancient forms of government and ways of thinking about it developed further in the Christian Europe of the Middle Ages, leading up until the 20th, in the 15th century, because we will end up next year at the same time, we will end up probably around the 15th century, where again the ideas of democracy and republic will become more and more popular on the verge of the early modern period of revolutions and a lot of changes in that regard. So hopefully then next year we will continue with this. So maybe we will have an opportunity to have a certain review of the history of tyranny and democracy from antiquity until the modern times, to look at different political theories about that, different actual historical situations. So that's very, very exciting, and it's all thanks to the, as you know, to the institution which I work in, Adam Mickiewicz University, also our grant program for the development of research, which is sponsoring this series and the next series as well. So and the fact that we can record it and publish it on the YouTube is, I think it's also important, so that people can watch it at any time, or you're free to use it if you want to use it as a tool for teaching at a university or just for any other purpose. Okay, so again, thank you very much for delivering your lectures.
Thank you for involving us, and I hope you'll keep us on your email list as you
Sure.
launch your next year's one, even if we don't happen to research the Middle Ages. I'd certainly like to learn more about it. So, but it's
well,
really,
I will send out the information, and I will invite all of the participants to at least track what will be going on. I mean, those will be also published on the YouTube. So if you can be there in time, you can always watch it. And okay, so again, thank you very much, and let's
Thank
stay
you.
in touch.
Yep, thank you. It was a great pleasure.